Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's time to talk about the new album from the Black Keys, titled Turn Blue. If you're a male music fan, there's one statement that I can make definitively. Either in the past, the present, or the future, at some point, you will be a fan of the Black Keys. For me, that period of fandom lasted about 3 weeks in the middle of August 2013. Now that's not saying I don't like the Black Keys or think they aren't a solid rock band, drawing back to the grimy, lo-fi era of garage rock and blues rock, but my fandom of this act has receded a fair bit over the months the more I've had a chance to reflect deeper upon their music. After all, the band's greatest strengths have been their knack for textured, rough-edged, melody-driven hooks with a swaggering blues-inspired edge. But here's the thing, the band has long been aware of this particular advantage, and over the course of 7 albums from 2002 to 2011, they milked that advantage as long as they possibly could. Now that's not saying they didn't write some killer songs along the way that I really do love, but the Black Keys, they had a formula, and outside of a few stylistic ventures, mostly thanks to Danger Mouse collaborations, they tended to stick to that formula. And while that formula did make for great singles, many of them that I really like, it didn't exactly make for great album statements. That, combined with the fact that the duo has written some pretty obnoxious lyrics, especially when talking about women, did mean that I cooled on the weaker parts of the Black Keys discography in record time. And thus, when I heard they were planning on switching up their formula with their newest album, Turn Blue, I was both intrigued and concerned. Now look, I'm all for bands like the Black Keys trying to experiment, but the opening singles for this record gave me a lot of pause, because not only was the distortion effectively gone, but the synth tone being used seemed really unflattering. A few enterprising critics made Foster the People comparisons. While I disagree somewhat with that assessment, it was certainly a sound far removed from typical Black Keys, and not exactly for the better. And thus, I'll admit this right now, I was not looking forward to Turn Blue by the Black Keys. Did I get proven wrong? Well, no, not really. Let me stress that this Black Keys record is by no means bad. Hell, I was expecting it to be a lot worse than it is. But it's not great, and I'm not even very sure it's good. But what's worse is that I can tell exactly what the Black Keys were trying to do with this album. And you know what? By all accounts, I'd argue they succeeded. But at the same time, it doesn't make this album something I enjoy or will want to revisit time and time again like other Black Keys albums. In other words, it's interesting, at least to talk about, but not exactly an album that I can recommend for you all here today. So okay, let's start with the biggest departure from the norm on this album, and that's in the instrumentation and in the production, which is very much along the lines of Attack and Release, but taken a little bit further. And you know what, to be fair, it's not that huge of a leap. As I said, the guitar work is still solid. I dig the hollowness in the bass drum, and the production has a feel of aged grit that adds plenty of texture to the songs. And you know what, even the bass work isn't half bad. And given that this album flirts with psychedelia, some isolated moments on this album were definitely worth it, like the synchronized guitars and Way to Love, the dreary yet impossibly catchy guitar melody of Turn Blue, the title track, the fuzz-saturated tone of It's Up to You Now, and you know what, I even kind of dug the keyboard solo in Our Prime. It's unfortunate though that might be the only keyboard segment that I found remotely tolerable on this album, all of which are thanks to producer and sometimes songwriter of the Black Keys, Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse. And just like his last album with Broken Bells, Burton's keyboard tonal choices range between just agreeable, if painfully flat if there's a piano, to just squealing, atonal, and grating beyond measure. I already mentioned Fever and talked about the singles, which is an otherwise solid enough track if it wasn't for this keyboard progression completely neutering the mood with an influx of minor keys and a really terrible tonal choice. And it's not just that the tonal choice sounds like they were imported from a bad Office training video in the mid-80s, but the choice of dreary, sour melodies only accentuate those negative sounds, and worst of all, not in any way that lends these tracks any sort of visceral emotion or real presence. What's even worse is that most of the lo-fi distortion pulled back entirely, and most of the melodies concentrated on the keyboards, the flash and the attitude that used to characterize some Black Keys records, some of the better ones, seems completely drained away, and the melodies look a lot less impressive. And even outside of that, the majority of this album feels really bereft of energy, and a song like In Time seems to bring back some of it to the table. It tries a little bit, but yet it feels suspiciously reminiscent of How Do You Like Me Now by The Heavy, or if you're just going back to a Return to the Black Black Keys' wheelhouse on songs like Gotta Get Away, which also, when you think about it, sounds a lot like Creedence Clearwater, and not in a good way. Now, granted, the vocals don't exactly help matters here. Dan Auerbach has a fine enough voice, and I like the rougher vocal production, but he frequently sounds disaffected and just bored behind the microphone. And that's not when he descends into a falsetto that sounds less and less flattering every single time I heard it. The backing female vocals don't help either. But while they might fit the gutless sourness of this record in a sleazy infomercial sort of way, it doesn't exactly make them pleasant or all that welcome on this album. Now, granted, they're more preferable to Auerbach's falsetto, but you know what? If you were looking to evoke any elements of grandeur that you typically see in psychedelic rock, they failed utterly and completely, because this album feels small, slimy, somewhat unimportant, and generally unpleasant. So you know what? If I've got so many negative comments about the sound of this album, why aren't I castigating it? Why aren't I being harsher and just condemning it outright? Well, honestly, I think it comes down to the point and sound that Auerbach was trying to make with this record, which takes us to lyrics and themes, and which for the Black Eyed Keys is probably the saving grace of this record. It's well documented that he was going through a divorce during the writing of the lyrics of this album, and you can definitely tell that there's residual bitterness as he writes the rough narrative of this record. It's a relationship that begins out of indecision and bad choices, where everything from the girl's aimless attitudes towards romance to the narrator's own doubts of the matter point towards everything going hopelessly wrong. And surprise, surprise, it all does go wrong. And the second half of the album is watching the relationship fall apart in slow motion, as the girl eventually musters up her courage and leaves the narrator. And of course he's heartbroken, but you get the feeling throughout the record that he seems less angry about the situation and more just resigned to the inevitable. It's almost like he knew all this was coming. And you know what? If I'm being incredibly honest with myself, it fits the tone of their album. It's sour and bitter and miserable, but it's telling that kind of story where the characters knowingly make bad decisions and it all blows up in their face. It does help matters that the framing is mostly indifferent to both parties and only really leaps on the evil woman train for the final track, Gotta Get Away, which is a song so upbeat and reminiscent of previous Black Keys albums that while it operates as a step into the light, it's also one that makes Auerbach look like a massive lying asshole. But outside of that bit of tonal dissonance, the music's choice to go for a chintzy commercial in terms of being used in faded advertisements from the 70s and going that grimy direction, it fits that kind of small-minded, petty, miserable story. Like it or not, all this does fit together. But you know what? I'm not gonna lie that there is a place for this kind of music and these sorts of stories. These sorts of stories are relatable, and the album is well framed enough to be realistic and human. But at the same time, it's not exactly a story I find pleasant or all that compelling, especially with the cop-out and the framing of the final track. And yet, I can't in good conscience say this album fails either, because you can tell that this album is trying to be as reflective and unpleasant as the story that it's telling, which for me, combined with the sheer awesomeness that is Way to Love, and the solid potency of the title track to some extent, it does elevate this album to a 6 out of 10, at least for me. But for the record, if Turn Blue is a deeper reflection of the songwriters, then I'm glad they've mostly been fit to stick with upbeat, remorselessly shallow crunch in their rock in the past. Those records, they really burned and they had some passionate fire. This album just kind of gutters out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine some of you are going to take issue with this, but hey, there's a lot better Black Keys records than this, so yeah, not a fun listening experience. If there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at, or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.